Little Shakira had been pumped with enough spider venom to kill 20 grown men.
His guts had been ripped out like most of the others. But the very odd thing was that his body was like mummified, wrapped up. Well, I mean, the only way I can describe it is like a spider's web.
You mean to tell me that the United Nations has to get involved for a simple logging operation? Yeah, okay. If that's the case, then I have a bridge to say. Now, if you ask me, these bastards were trying to aggressively get rid of something.
A few weeks later, I was arrested for being part of the gang and accused of crimes I did not commit.
The country of Trae'Lao lies in the center of the African continent. Almost surrounded by the Nile Spill Riverway, it can almost be considered an island nation in its own right. Its formal discovery can be dated to the year 1717 by British explorer and adventurer Sir William James Renfrew. The region was populated by the indigenous Savarath tribe, a hardy African peoples whose own history dated back to almost 2500 BC. Instead of conquest and enslavement, Sir Renfrew cultivated a mutual working relationship with the Savarath people, and for the next 50 years, British agencies began to gradually assimilate the native tribesmen into every aspect of Northern European culture. But the discovery of rich deposits of gold ore in 1770 dramatically changed the dynamic and cultural landscape of the nation of Trae'Lao. In short order, the British Crown declared Trae'Lao as one of its expanded colonies, and extensive mining operations were instituted throughout the regions. This came at great expense of the Savarath people, and most of them were relegated as a labor class to mine the rich gold ore. The indigenous people would suffer under British control for the next 70 years. But in 1852, an uprising led by a man named Gando Rowe successfully overthrew the British colonists, resulting in a bloody 6-year conflict between English forces and the Savarath revolutionaries. Finally, in 1858, Trae'Lao won its complete independence. But by that time, British culture had become so ingrained in the native Savarath, it was the only culture they knew. As a result, the newly independent nation adopted much of British governmental institutions as well as Western fashions and cultural norms. Only a handful of elders spoke native Savarath, with much of the younger generations speaking only English. Today, the nation of Trae'Lao operates as a constitutional monarchy, with a king and queen as symbolic figureheads, whilst a prime minister serves as the head of practical government. This brings us to the year of 1990 and the start of a chain of disappearances, abductions, and gruesome murders that would ensnare the African nation in a palpable grip of fear, the likes of which had never been seen before or since. A bizarre string of events that will lead us down a road of mystery, conspiracy, intrigue, and some would even say unbelievably fantastic, that it has captivated the imaginations of researchers the world over. This is the story of the Spider Gang of Trae'Lao. We begin with the disappearance of 7-year-old Shakira Saf. Shakira was on a field trip excursion with her class near the jungle preserve of Kava Ray. The class of about 20 or so students were on a nature trail led and monitored closely by their teacher and 2 jungle preserve rangers. The students had been enjoying a morning of hiking and learning about the dense jungle environment. By all means, it was a day of fun, and everyone, including Shakira, had been in good spirits. When the field trip had braked for lunch, the class sat around in a picnic-like setting. At some point, Shakira is theorized to have wandered off into the surrounding jungle, disappearing into its dense underbrush. When her absence was finally noticed, a full-scale search was ordered by the Preserve Ranger patrols. However, Shakira's disappearance was branded as high-profile as she was the youngest daughter of Delvar Saf, a high-ranking colonel in the Trae'Lao army. His daughter's vanishing would set off a chain of events that some say leads to one of the most terrifying mysteries in the human experience. Little Shakira remained a missing person for a total of 16 days, and despite one of the largest searches in Trae'Lao history, frustratingly little could be found in the way of evidence. However, unbeknownst to most at the time was that Shakira's disappearance was only one of several bizarre vanishings and abductions that seemed to skyrocket throughout the entire region since the beginning of 1990. The search for 7-year-old Shakira Saf would come to a tragic end when a group of loggers would discover her gruesome remains near a jungle logging trail.
I'll never forget it to this day. Mama came in crying and said, "They found your sister, and she is dead." I remember that day in particular was the end of my innocence. Things were just never the same.
The scene where Shakira's body was found was both morbid and peculiar. Her body had been horribly mutilated, with her torso seemingly ripped open, several of her internal organs missing. Her skin was dried out and flaky, and every ounce of blood and fluid had been drained from her system.
I had never performed an autopsy like this before. The body was completely drained of all fluids and the torso had been torn open. The heart, lungs, liver and large intestine were all missing. It almost seemed as if the little girl had been killed by some kind of a ravenous animal. But the most shocking thing was in the toxicology report. Her system was pumped full of necrotic polypeptides and enzymes. Basically, in layman's terms, little Shakira had been pumped with enough spider venom to kill 20 grown men.
But this was only the beginning. More bodies would begin popping up, many found in the exact same state as Shakira's. By the autumn of 1991, a further 10 bodies would be found horrifically mutilated. Trae'Lao authorities began to suspect that a particularly barbaric serial killer was on the loose. But how could so many people's deaths be the work of a single perpetrator? Then a news story would break that would set the ball rolling. Eldon Corey, a lead Belgian journalist working in Trae'Lao at the time, explains.
People were in an absolute panic. The consensus was that there was some kind of maniac on the loose in Trae'Lao. I remember distinctly there was an elder fella whose body was found almost a year after he had gone missing. His guts had been ripped out like most of the others. But the very odd thing was that his body was like mummified, wrapped up. Well, the only way I can describe it is like a spider's web. It's like something straight out of a horror film or something. Another thing I recall is this old man that some of the police have been questioning. He just kept saying over and over again, J'Ba Fofi. I had no idea what that meant, but of course I took a note of it. When I got back to write up the article, I included the name J'Ba Fofi. Well, my editor, the bastard that he was, damn near rewrote my entire article. He took the name J'Ba Fofi and came up with this wild theory that there was this new gang operating in Trae'Lao and that they were going by the name J'Ba Fofi. I'll tell you, it caught like wildfire.
As wild as the events of Trae'Lao may seem, there are actually numerous case files and accounts stretching the decades that tell of similar encounters. One such story comes from the turn of the 18th century near the Congo Basin. A Belgian trafficking patrol had been sent to intercept a group of Arab slave traders, however they failed to return from their mission. Several days passed with no word from the Belgian company, until finally 2 men emerged from the jungle. Both were grievously injured, dehydrated, and mentally driven to the point of insanity. One of the 2 men, a Belgian officer by the name of Captain Remy Janssen, relayed a story so unbelievable it actually led to the credibility of its truthfulness. Otherwise, why would anyone fabricate such an outlandish tale? Janssen said that whilst on patrol, his men were ambushed by Congolese mercenaries. They were taking heavy fire, and a few casualties were incurred. The rest of the Belgian patrol fled deeper into the jungle to regroup. Soon, they became hopelessly lost amongst the winding jungle thicket. The patrol spent many days wandering the jungle interiors, losing more of their number to starvation and heat exhaustion. Finally stopping to rest near a clearing, the surrounding rainforest went eerily silent, and their situation suddenly went from bad to worse. Out of nowhere, the group was swarmed by gigantic spider-like creatures that darted out of the brush and began to attack Janssen and his men. The captain described these 8-legged abominations as spiders the size of large dogs, hairy and containing fangs that resembled pointed sabers jutting out of their gnarled mandibles. The creatures viciously attacked the terrified company, killing many of them where they stood. Others dragged, screaming in fear and agony, into the dark jungle, presumably to be eaten. Janssen and one of his African guides attempted to fight back, but were swiftly overwhelmed by the nightmarish creatures. They broke rank and managed to escape, leaving the rest of their patrol to their grisly fate. It had been nearly 2 years since the abduction and awful death of Shakira Saf, and Trae'Lao had been gripped by fear amongst a string of unexplained disappearances and murders. The press were running with the story that a new and terrifying street gang dubbed the J'Ba Fofi were the ones responsible for the sudden spike in violence and abductions. However, journalist Eldon Corey wasn't convinced that all the chaos were at the hands of a simple street gang and set out to properly investigate further. He embarked on a series of extended expeditions into the outskirts and dark jungles where many of the mutilated bodies had been discovered.
I started interviewing a lot of the locals and got pretty deep into the folklore of the region. I even managed to track down the old gentleman that had given the supposed street gang their name. Now come to find out that J'Ba Fofi literally translates into giant spider.
According to ancient Trae'Lao myth and folklore, the J'Ba Fofi are a group of malevolent jungle spirits who take the physical form of giant arachnids that viciously guard the sacred hallow spaces within the surrounding forests. If anyone were to willfully trespass on this sacred land, they would be punished by the monstrous J'Ba Fofi. But surely, the idea of gargantuan killer arachnids loose in the African jungles was preposterous, or was it? Well, Eldon Corey was about to secure even more evidence that brought everything into sharp question.
So it was on my third or fourth expedition when I really started to take this idea of the actual J'Ba Fofi seriously. I mean, there are all kinds of undiscovered wildlife in the remote places of the earth. Was it really so crazy to think that there might be a species of giant killer spider undiscovered in the wild? But needless to say, when my fellow journalists found out that I was possibly looking for the existence of giant bugs in the jungle, a lot of them thought that I needed to be committed to a rubber room. But nevertheless, I pressed on. Now those jungles can be pretty creepy at night, and I made sure that me and my guides were armed to the teeth at all times. Some of my guides managed to snap some photos, and they have me pretty convinced we were dealing with something unknown to science. Now granted, a lot of these photos are grainy and out of focus, but they paint a pretty clear picture in my mind. There is something very sinister stalking the jungles of Trae'Lao.
Another obscure account of a terrifying encounter with the J'Ba Fofi creatures is related through the horrific story of Arthur Symes, a British missionary sent on assignment in Uganda sometime around the year 1890. The story says that Arthur was en route to a small village on the shores of Lake Nalisawa. In a particularly dense part of the jungle, Symes and his two porters found themselves ensnared in a cluster of web-like netting so large it covered several square feet of the jungle floor. Struggling to cut themselves loose from the webs, the trio was suddenly attacked by a pair of man-sized spider monsters, very similar to mammoth-sized tarantulas. The creatures grabbed a hold of the two porters, swiftly immobilizing them with their enormous arachnid fangs. Symes broke free from the webbing that had ensnared him, quickly drew his pistol and fired directly at the creatures. He managed to scare them off, but it was far too late by that point. His companions had succumbed to the lethal amount of venom that was now ravaging their bodies. A terrified Arthur Symes wandered several more days in the jungle until he was discovered by some of the villagers he had come to see in the first place. Symes was ranting wildly and was in a state of crazed delirium as he tried to relay his story about the monstrous spiders that had ambushed him and killed his two companions. Oddly, the villagers didn't seem at all surprised by Symes's fantastic tale. According to them, in this neck of the jungle, it was an all too familiar occurrence with the demonic J'Ba Fofi. After completing his fourth inquiry and expedition into the nature of the true J'Ba Fofi, Corey had a sizable collection of eyewitness testimony, interviews and photographs. But he was in for a rude shock when he tried to submit his findings to his editorial superiors. Whilst he was out on assignment, his offices had been visited by military members of the current Atrocian regime. Corey's chief editors were threatened not to publish any more about the supposed J'Ba Fofi gang. They seized all records pertaining to the story and informed everyone that the entire incident was under their direct supervision from this moment forward. If anyone reported on the story any further, they would face harsh penalties and even incarceration. Corey himself received a visit from a battalion patrol at his home. He claims that he was threatened and intimidated to keep silent about his discoveries, lest there would be severe consequences. Much like his staff, all his records, cameras, microphones, documents, and any physical evidence he had collected in the jungle was seized.
It was pretty intense. They interrogated me for hours. They said that if I were to so much as breathe another word about the J'Ba Fofi incidents, they would burn down my house and kill my family. They were handling this now, and that's all there was to it. I never saw those original photographs again, but luckily I hid the negatives. It took me another 6 years to flee from Trae'Lao and publish the negatives that I had. There is no doubt in my mind that this was a government cover-up from the very highest levels. There is something in those jungles that the Trae'Laoan government doesn't want anybody to know about.
In the spring of 1938, married couple Reginald and Margaret Lloyd were on assignment exploring the African interior of the Congo. The couple were spending an evening off-roading in their old Ford flatbed. They were nearing a bend in one of the dirt roads when Reginald spotted something attempting to cross. In the darkness, he could barely make out the outline of whatever was on the road. But due to its gait and stance, Reginald surmised that it was either a large monkey on all fours or perhaps an exceptional-sized cat. The couple slowed down in order to let the animal pass, but as the vehicle got closer, the animal came into sharp focus of the automobile's headlights. To their sheer horror, this thing was neither a monkey nor a cat. The creature strongly resembled a disturbingly large spider with brownish-black hair covering its body. Margaret screamed in terror as Reginald shook in the driver's seat. He seemed more excited than scared and looked around the cab of the truck for his camera. But unfortunately, by the time he located it, the nightmarish creature had crawled back into the jungle and out of sight. Margaret begged her husband to floor the gas as she desperately wanted to get out of there, something to which he reluctantly agreed to. Margaret was emotionally distraught for several days afterward and refused to speak of the incident for many years. The story only came by way of Reginald and Margaret's daughter Marjorie, who says that her parents were shaken to their core by what they witnessed that night back in 1938. Beginning in the summer of 1992, the Trae'Lao government, with the help of some large outside conglomerates, began an aggressive deforesting campaign of many of the jungles surrounding the country. The nation was besieged by jungle work crews and heavy logging machinery. In 4 years, the campaign had cut down and burned so many trees that they risked an ecological habitat disaster in the region. It is estimated that nearly 100 different species of plant and animal had been wiped out due to loss of habitat.
They were on an absolute rampage. These maniacs destroyed so many of our forests, it was unbelievable. It's like they were on a mission or something. Rumor has it that it wasn't just any old big corporations that were coming in either. the Atrocian government was receiving direct funding from the United Nations. You mean to tell me that the United Nations has to get involved for a simple logging operation? Yeah, okay. If that's the case, then I have a bridge to sell you. Now, if you ask me, these bastards were trying to aggressively get rid of something.
On the morning of January 8th, 1996, headline news was breaking all over the nation of Trae'Lao. Police had finally captured the elusive and dangerous J'Ba Fofi, or the Spider Gang, as they'd come to more commonly be referred to as. Law enforcement had rounded up 10 members of the supposed ritualistic gang and now had them in custody. What followed was a media frenzy.
Oh, very convenient. None more than a few months after the last deforestation cruiser left, the police just happened to capture all the members of this so-called gang. I mean, sometimes you have to ask yourself, just how stupid do these government officials think that we are? Those guys took the fall for something that was not natural, if you ask me.
Each member of the gang was sentenced to 30 years to life for the spate of horrific murders that had plagued the country for almost a decade. The reign of terror had seemingly come to an abrupt end. The Spider Gang was no more, but that was far from the end of the story. In 2005, an independent researcher named Harold Majors managed to secure an interview that would rock the bizarre saga of the Spider Gang. Harold had been studying the Trae'Lao murders since 1995 and amazingly had tracked down one of the supposed gang members. The man had served 4 years in a Trae'Lao prison until a sympathetic guard smuggled him out of the prison, securing his escape. The man, whom we will refer to as Kwame, emigrated to the United States and currently lives in hiding for fear of discovery. He sat down with Harold and gave a detailed interview. The story he had to tell just adds another layer of conspiracy and mystery to this entire odyssey.
My name is... and I was born in Trae'Lao. I lived a pretty ordinary life as a young man, and I kind of got involved with the wrong crowd. I had some convictions for theft and drugs, but I never hurt anyone, let alone the thought of killing anyone. I was of course aware of all the disappearances and murders that had been going on, and I was just as mystified as anyone else. Then in late 1995, I was sitting in my kitchen having breakfast with my wife, when 3 men came knocking at my door. They had army uniforms and told me that I was to accompany them down to the police station. I of course asked them why, but they were insistent that all my questions would be answered at the station. So reluctantly, I went with them. Over the next 4 hours or so, they began to lay out this scenario that was unbelievable to my ears. They offered me 40 million stavans to confess to the Spider Gang murders. I said that was crazy. I hadn't done anything wrong. They tried to sweeten the deal. Told me that the rest of my family would be well taken care of in addition to the 40 million. I still refused. So when that didn't work, they started on with the threats. I tell you, by the end of that interrogation, they had me convinced they would kill my wife and every other member of my family if I did not comply. What else was I supposed to do? I could not risk my wife's safety. A few weeks later, I was arrested for being part of the gang and accused of crimes I did not commit. Myself and 9 other poor souls were the fall guys for something that their government wanted to hide. I thank God for Deputy Janice, who had pity on me and helped me escape. But my wife did not make it. She died a year after I was imprisoned, and I will not discuss the manner of her death. To this day, I still live in absolute fear that they are going to find me. There was definitely something very sinister going on in those jungles, and the government was willing to ruin 10 people's lives in order to cover it up. On the life of my beloved Belinda, what I told you is true.
Trying to stay hot on the heels of the case, it takes Harold Majors another 3 years to secure another key piece of evidence in the Spider Gang saga. In early 2008, the Atrocian government of Trae'Lao was displaced during the outbreak of a violent civil war. The insurgents prevailed and instituted a new republican form of government known as the Rava Libertarians. With the fall of the old regime, a treasure trove of old classified documents were leaked out onto the internet. Among the fountain of documents was a memo entitled Jungle Discovery.
The Jungle Discovery memo was the holy grail when it came to this case. Now, yes, it's entirely possible that the document could have been faked, but I've run every authenticating test known to man, and it seemed legit. Now, in a nutshell, a memo was sent out to the key heads of the Atrocian military, as well as Prime Minister Havilah at the time. It details the discovery by a battalion of Trae'Lao and company in the jungle 20 miles north of the city of Vinta in the winter of 1987. Now, according to the memo, these soldiers found the rotting carcass of a giant arachnid closely resembling a Goliath bird-eating tarantula. This thing had a leg span of over 12 feet, if you can believe it. Basically a man-sized spider, fangs the size of a goddamn butcher knife. They had discovered indisputable proof of the existence of the mythical J'Ba Fofi of African lore. When they performed tests on the carcass, they found the internal respiratory system was unlike anything found in any other living arthropod. It more closely resembled that of a mammal, which was the key that allowed this thing to grow to such a size. It came from a special type of fungi that somehow supercharged these arachnids' oxygen intake. After a lot of tinkering, scientists managed to synthesize the chemicals in the fungi, hoping to replicate this phenomenal growth in other organisms. What they found was when the synthesized chemicals were injected into the bodies of various spiders, it killed 95% of the test subjects. Only about 2 in every 100 spiders survived. But the ones that did started to mutate, and it's in their offspring where the new respiratory tracts were present. They were passed down from the mutated DNA of the surviving spiders. But as with anything that big government gets involved in, the experiments got away from them. A clutch of baby spiders escaped one of the labs and got into the surrounding jungles. With a combination of their mutated DNA and the super-rich oxygen environment of the jungles, these things grew phenomenally fast. But although they spent billions of dollars with the aid of the United Nations trying to clean up their mess, you have to ask yourself a question. Even though the lab-grown J'Ba Fofi were wiped out, these things were created in nature. Now, probably not as fast, but still. There are still man-sized arachnids loose in the jungles of the world. I don't know about you, that is one hell of a terrifying thought.
We have to ask ourselves just what the truth is concerning this most bizarre of cases. Are there really man-sized killer spiders lurking in the most inaccessible parts of the globe? The Survey for Natural Discoveries states that less than 20% of all the species on Earth have been catalogued by science. There is a whole lot out there that we just don't know about. As Shakespeare famously wrote, "There is more in heaven and earth that is dreamt of in your philosophy."